إنا فتحنا لك فتحا مبينا.
A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Committed Muslims, brothers, sisters, and youth in Islam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We want to continue to look at the various concepts and injunctions in the Noble Qur'an. And today we are going to look at this ayat from Surah Fatha, which relates to the events surrounding the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. Now, the ayat says, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. This is the first ayat of this surah. Inna fatahna laka fatham mubin. And it means approximately that verily we have, O Prophet, granted you a manifest victory. Now, in order to understand the significance of this ayat, and in fact the sequences of ayats following this, we need to understand a little bit of the background of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. In the 6th year of the Hijrah, the Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam had a dream, or he told his companions that he has had a dream or a vision that Muslims were performing Umrah. Now, based on that, about 1400 Muslims accompanied the Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and they set out from Medina towards Mecca. They were dressed in ihram, they had their sacrificial animals with them, and only one sword each, which was of course permitted, but is not considered an instrument of aggression, because with just one sword, this was needed for protection and so on. So they set out. And of course, the Meccan mushriks learnt about this contingent of Muslims, 1400 of them arriving in Mecca, and they were obviously greatly perturbed, and they decided not to allow the Muslims to enter Mecca. So the Muslims were intercepted at a place called Hudaybiyah. This was called Hudaybiyah at that time. Today, of course, that place is called Shumasa, and that's the point at which non-Muslims are prohibited to move any closer towards Mecca. So when Muslims go for Hajj, they set out from Jeddah, and when they arrive at Shumasa, that's where their documents, etc., are checked, and then they are allowed to enter the boundaries of Mecca. At Shumasa, of course, a great deal of discussions, negotiations took place, and ultimately the following terms were agreed upon. Number one, that Muslims would go back this year, and they will not perform their Umrah, but they can come back next year, and the Mushrikeen would leave Makkah for 3 days so that there are no encounters among Muslims and the Mushrikeen, and then after 3 days Muslims would leave. Number two, that there is going to be peace between the Muslims and the Mushriks. Now Muslims are recognized as a separate entity. Hitherto they were not. So this was the first time that the Muslims were recognized as a separate entity, and that Muslims and the Mushriks were free to enter into any agreements that they want, so that they would not interfere with each other. Number three, they also stipulated that any Muslim prisoner that escapes from Makkah and goes to Medina, then Muslims are obliged to return that Muslim prisoner back to Makkah. Whereas anybody who escapes from Medina and goes to Makkah, the Mushriks are not obligated to return that person. And of course, these things to the companions of the Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they appear terribly, terribly unfair and unjust. But the Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam could understand and see the larger importance of this treaty. And of course, as the articles of this treaty were being implemented, when Muslims wanted to flee Makkah, they realized that they can't go to Medina because they would be returned to Makkah. So instead, what they did was that they would escape from Makkah, and they started to seek sanctuary in the highlands along the trade route west of Medina, which was closer to the Red Sea, so that when Meccan caravans passed through there, that these Muslims would attack them, ambush them and attack them, and get resources from them. And of course, this began to increase so much that the Meccan mushriks were terrified, and they themselves came to the Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam and asked that this provision of the treaty be removed, and when the Muslim prisoners escape from Makkah, when they arrive in Medina, that the Muslims are no longer obligated to return them. So that was one manifestation of this treaty that most of the companions were unable to understand. Secondly, now Muslims were free to enter into agreements with other tribes or clans, etc., and that increased the power of the Muslims tremendously. And then, of course, the Meccan mushriks violated the terms of this treaty as well, that they attacked one of the clans that was aligned with the Muslims. This clan was in Makkah, and instead of paying restitution or punishing the offending party, the Meccan mushriks refused to abide by the terms of the treaty. So then the Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam sent word to them that since you have violated the terms of the treaty, you are not fulfilling them, therefore this treaty is now null and void, and the Muslims therefore were able to march on Makkah to liberate it in the 8th year of the Hijrah. So when we look at this ayat and the series of ayats that follow after this in Surah Fatha, we see that this ayat actually came true in the lifetime of the Muslims within a couple of years, in fact, when they could see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has granted them a manifest victory. That the terms of the treaty appeared to be so unjust for Muslims were in fact extremely beneficial to Muslims. And this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promises to the committed Muslims, that they will be tried and tested, and yet if they remain firm and committed to Allah and His Messenger, then Allah's help and victory would come, the victory would be granted to the Muslims, as we see in this ayat. And as I had mentioned in the previous couple of sequences about the testing of the Muslims and Allah's exhortation to Muslims that they must sacrifice their families and their lives and their wealth, etc., in the way of Allah. And here we see that in this ayat, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is granting, first of all, proclaiming that victory would come to the Muslims, and then it actually manifests itself in a physical sense. And so we as Muslims can take comfort in the fact that if we remain committed to Allah and His Messenger, that Allah's help would manifest itself in our lives and we would achieve victory. Thank you for watching. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.